The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and today in our regular Week in Review edition, I am joined by my two favorite China-Africa analysts, Cobus and Geraud, China Global South's managing editor in Johannesburg, and Cobus and Geraud in Mauritius, our Francophone editor. A very good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
You must be exhausted after this week. We have been up morning to night covering the big events that have been unfolding in Washington all week in the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. This was the first summit of its kind in 8 years. The Biden administration really wanted to make a big effort to show that it's breaking with past certainly the previous administration. And it also wanted to use this week to showcase how its approach to Africa is different than that of China and other major players. It really wanted to re-emphasize many of the same themes that it outlined in its new strategy for sub-Saharan Africa that it unveiled back in August, I think it was. And they really hit those notes throughout the course of the week. What we're going to do today is we're going to pick a few of the big themes that came up, especially talking about China, of course. We're going to get Cobus's and Geraud's reaction to it. I want to first kind of lay out and make the case for all the different things that happened this week. We're going to start on the positives, and then we're going to go to a few of the more critical assessments of it. Let's first start with President Biden himself. On Wednesday, he gave the keynote address, and the big takeaway is that he said the U.S. is all in when it comes to Africa.
The United States is all in on Africa's future. Africa's economic transition depends on good government, healthy populations, and reliable and affordable energy. These things business seeks out when they're looking to invest. They attract new opportunities, and they launch new partnerships. And the United States is committed to supporting every aspect of Africa's inclusive growth. All of you, the deals you've signed, the investments we've made together are concrete proof of the enduring commitment we're making to one another, government to government, business to business, people to people. The most important, and this is just the beginning, there's so much more we can do together and that we'll do together. So thank you for your participation today, for being part of another historic U.S. African Leaders Summit. We've got a lot of ground to cover in the coming days, and I'm eager to listen to the priorities you have for the future of the partnership between our nations. So thank you.
Okay, Geraud, he's eager to listen. Lots was accomplished. You were tasked this week to kind of keep track of everything that happened. Go through some of the highlights for us. Bring us up to date on what happened at the summit.
The summit was really interesting, and there are some good commitment and deals that were signed during the summit, and that kind of highlights why the U.S. is showing willingness to move forward in Africa. One of the interesting deals that we followed was, of course, when it comes to mining industry, there was the MOU signed between the U.S., Zambia, and DRC on the value chain of critical minerals. We have to remember that last April, the two countries, the DRC and Zambia, they signed an agreement on how they're going to work together to create critical mineral value chain locally and building EV battery industry in the country. So with that signing, the US is showing support to the two countries and especially sending the message that, we're still present in that discourse. Even though it's a non-binding agreement, still it's a kind of strong message from the US to say, we want to be part of the discussion. We really want to show that we're going to be present. So is it how the implementation is going to happen? It's still up to see. The second interesting deal happened still in the mining industry was the cobalt minerals signing a deal with Zambia, and there it was really interesting because Secretary Jaina Raimondo was kind of giving the context on how they reached the point of signing with Zambia because of the good business environment, rule of law, political stability and everything. And it was really interesting because when Biden was speaking, we can echo echo the same element. And the same comment kind of came through from different people in the U.S. administration when they were talking about signing deals in Africa. They were kind of coming with the same element of political stability, good environment, rule of law, and everything. So some other deal, we had Visa, and Visa who committed to $1 billion for the next 5 years in Africa in terms of providing mobile payment service for micro and small, medium-sized business across the continent. We had another deal coming from U.S. Exim Bank that signed a MOU with U.S. Exim Bank and Afri-Exim Bank for $500 million to boost trade, investment, and transportation, especially with airlines in Africa. So Prosper Africa that signed another deal, another MOU with Future Africa Fund, which is a fund that helps small, medium enterprise and startups in Africa. They want to boost new startups in Africa because for those who don't know, Future Fund Africa is the one that has like Flutterware and Amandala, one of those big startups in Africa. So yeah, we had some kind of interesting big deals and commitment throughout different sectors on the continent.
So in all, there are about $15 billion of deals that were signed. A lot of those are MOUs, so they're not contracts. Just a note that doesn't mean they always follow through, but they tend to lead to something. So $15 billion was the number from the private sector. $55 billion was the number from the government. And this was very interesting. Cobus, I'd like to get your take on this. This was announced on Monday by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at the White House during a press conference.
In Africa, we have the perception that the U.S. looked down on Africa. So with this summit, what makes you feel so comfortable?
We are bringing the resources to the table in significant numbers. And if you compare what the United States is committing over the next 3 years to what any other country is committing, I think we stack up extremely favorably.
Okay, any other country is French for China, of course, because nobody else is going to be bringing in that kind of money. Cobus, the $55 billion number, I think, was supposed to be a major headline of this event. They announced it on Monday. It got zero traction. Nobody really picked up on it. The African media, the African press didn't talk about it. It is a big contrast in many respects to the Chinese numbers that come at the end of FOCAC meetings, where everybody's looking, will it be 20 billion? Will it be 40 billion? Will it be 60 billion? Why, in your view, did the 55 billion number that Jake Sullivan announced on Monday fall flat?
I think because one then immediately needs to attach an asterisk to it, saying that it's not all new funding. It includes a lot of kind of pre-existing programs and pre-existing commitments, some of which go back years and which kind of encompass kind of America's, kind of aid spending on Africa. So kind of 55 billion is impressive, definitely, but at the same time, it's maybe not. I think the reason why it didn't become a headline is because it actually isn't that new.
That's not entirely fair, though, because the Japanese recycle their numbers, the Chinese recycle their numbers. It's not all new money. The Chinese, in fact, don't even always spend all the money that they commit. It just seems like that's not entirely a fair standard. I'm not blaming you. Clearly, people in Africa were not impressed by this number. We tracked the media coverage all week, and nobody really got excited about that.
Yes, very muted media coverage in Africa about the entire summit. Like, no one really cared about it, yeah.
So one of the big problems with this number, and Joe, let's get your take on this as well, was the fact that, again, they didn't break down the number. What the Chinese do when they announce at FOCAC, and this is what they did at the last FOCAC last year, is they announced their number. Remember, they said $10 billion for SDRs, $10 billion for this, $5 billion for this, and it was much more tangible. So I think that's one reason. The United States just said the 55 billion number. That was it. There was no accompanying information. There was no context to it. Number two.
It is interesting. Sorry to interrupt. It is interesting that used to be the approach that the Chinese followed until 2021. So remember, in 2021, we were doing all of this math to try and kind of get to a final number because they were breaking it down.
But they still outlined Xi outlined 40 billion. He didn't outline the last 20 billion.
Yeah, but it was interesting to see how the Chinese chose not to run with a big number, like last time, and this time the Americans did. There's liabilities on both sides of that calculation, I think.
No, there's no doubt. And Japan, for a long time, avoided a number. And at the last TCAD summit, they came out with a $30 billion number. That got quite a bit of coverage, no doubt about it. Geraud, you and I were talking about it as well. It's a little frustrating from the point of view of the American government in the sense that they provide $11 to $12 billion a year in humanitarian aid. So if you map that out over 3 years, that's about $34 billion of the total 55 that's existing already. If you take into account some of the DFC money, that's the Development Finance Corporation money, a third of their $60 billion budget is allocated for Africa. They probably carved a portion of that, put that into the 55 billion. They didn't tell us where the money's coming from. I'm just speculating. And so they went around to all the different agencies and they said, add up what you're doing for Africa. Let's bundle it in and off we go. Cobus's point is that it's not new money, so it's not news. Who cares? One of the other points that I made in my discussion with you, and I'd like to get your take on it, is because these are American priorities. These are U.S. priorities. This was not necessarily done in consultation with Africans. So the focus is on climate and health. And the point that I made is that presidents and prime ministers don't win elections on health and climate issues. They win elections on bringing money home for infrastructure, for jobs, and things that have a much more immediate turnaround, which is one of the reasons why I think that people get more excited about the Chinese money than they do this $55 billion announcement from Jake Sullivan and the U.S. government. What's your take?
My take is that, as Cobus said, you also spoke about it, the fact that, first of all, there was no breakdown of the numbers, so we really don't know how much about where it's going to go where. Second of all, as I say, since we don't know where it's going where, basically no country had like a fixed number to say, I'm going to, out of the 50 billion, myself, I'm going to take 5 billion for infrastructure, 10 billion for this, anything. So basically, there was no political gain for the delegation there to kind of, send the number back to the countries to be pushing on how much that trip to the US was a victory for them. So they bring back money, they bring back investment. There was nothing for them to show for. So African media did not really had to share about that. To be fair, there was some coverage. There basically some coverage from different newspapers I've kind of read here and there. But the difference was in the coverage was much more a kind of piggyback of the news that coming from big agency, Reuters, France 24 and everything. So there was no really much of in-depth analysis or went on.
It was uninspired coverage. It was just kind of like pro forma, take the AP wire copy, put it in. There was no excitement around it.
And some of the coverage that I also saw was tending to focus on like the domestic kind of connection to these things. So I saw coverage, for example, in the Kenyan press that the Kenyan president was kind of try and kind of like have a side deal made, kind of during his trip to get new investment in the national airline, for example. So I think one of the reasons why the coverage was relatively muted was that the numbers tended to be, we don't know a lot of details about the numbers yet. They haven't really been broken down, but they also haven't been broken down by country. So there isn't, as Geraud mentioned, there isn't really a takeaway that a national leader and a national press corps can bring back to a national audience, for any specific country. It was all kind of like couched in terms of the entire sub-Saharan Africa or the entire continent. So it's a big continent, so any kind of individual kind of press corps, and there's nothing really here for us specifically to cover.
Imagine though, had they had it broken down by country, they could have generated a lot more interest, no doubt.
Of course, we even saw that on how government press corps, those who are going, those who went with different presidents, they were much more vocal when there was like this meeting with Biden. They say this happened. They kind of put a spin on the meeting. We talked about this and this happened, but they did not really talk about that 55 billion were given to Africa, because somehow the question was going to be how much are we going to get out of those 50 billion? And the third point I wanted to make is like kind of it's coming from the US in terms of commitment. Sometimes people since we don't know if really it's going to come up, we don't want to be coming up with those big numbers and showing and talking about that. And later on, nobody's going to come and say, did we really get those 55 billion? And of course, there's also the last point that you made is about how much sexy is where the money is going from, is going to. So we didn't hear about like big infrastructure projects, big this, big that. So at the end, people are like, it's 55 billion, but people were not really excited about the fact that it's going to create political gain for the leaders who went to the meeting for 3 days.
I think there's also the other kind of really important factor is that some of that money is still dependent on congressional approval. I think that is one of the realities, kind of in dealing with the United States, is that there are these pledges, but there's political realities on the US side, and particularly at the moment, there's no guarantee necessarily that this Congress will go for this kind of funding, or that, whatever happens in 2024 will also probably change those commitments.
But we actually don't know how much is dependent on Congress. Some of it, or most of it, could actually be already approved money that, again, they're just repackaging and putting forward down the line. Now, the administration has done its very best over the past 6 to 9 months to try and separate their Africa policy from the word China. And it's not an easy thing to do. And in part because for the past 20 years, and I remember this because back in Kinshasa in 2009 or 10, when Hillary Clinton came and I was there, it was China, 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 China. That's all they've been talking about for 20 years. And now in this year, they've said, okay, we don't want to talk about China. Now, I want you to listen to this exchange at the press conference on Thursday at the end of the event between a reporter from ABC News and Secretary Blinken. And I want you to see how the question starts and how Blinken takes it.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken. Through the course of the summit, you have been very careful to make the case that the administration doesn't want to force African nations to choose between the U.S. and China. But the Secretary of Defense clearly said that Beijing's influence on the continent is a destabilizing threat. Do you share that assessment?
Thank you. This summit is about one thing, Africa and the relationship between the United States and Africa. It's about one region and only one region, Africa. It's not about any other region. It's not about any other country. And I think you heard that across the board this week. And I recognize people may want to turn it into something else, but sometimes the thing is just what it is. And this is the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. And fundamentally, it's about what we are affirmatively able to bring to the table, some of which I described. The partnerships, the investments that are based on shared interests and shared values. And again, done in a way that's transparent, that's high quality, that's sustainable. And with a focus on empowering local communities, respecting their needs, their decisions, their rights. That is what we've been talking about for the last 3 days. And in doing that, we're actually creating more opportunity for Africans, more opportunity for Americans. Now, if other countries have the ability and the will to do the same thing, that's great. There's more than enough need to go around. But from our perspective, to the extent that anyone else is engaged, we just want to make sure it's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. We want to make sure that when we're seeing investments in Africa, they're done to the highest standards. They're not piling debt on countries. They're not abusing workers or importing workers from outside. They respect the environment. They don't bring corruption with them. If that's the case, if we have these affirmative partnerships and investments, then it's great for everyone to be involved. And ultimately, as I said, this is about choices that Africans will make, and our purpose is simply to make sure that they have a good choice. That's what this is about.
Oh, Tony. You almost made it to the finish line. You almost made it to the finish line. And again, they have this positive affirmative view. This is not about China, but we don't want countries, I'm not going to say which country it is, to pile on debt, to bring in workers, to blah, blah, blah. The same things that they've been saying for years. Cobus, this presented a real dilemma for not only Secretary Blinken, but also Secretary Austin, the Defense Secretary, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the UN ambassador, or the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And, they kept getting asked these questions about China. And you wrote earlier this week about how they struggled mightily to respond to this, not only to try and say, we don't want to talk about China, but we're going to tell you all the bad things about China. But then when they did speak about China, it was tragically outdated and misinformed.
Yeah, that was a little sad, making that, kind of, it's just, those old talking points, they have staying power. you can't get them out of there, no matter how hard you try.
They really do. I mean, they just kept coming back over and over again. And you should have seen some of the other things coming out of Congress. And I kept saying, the China Global South Project subscription makes for a wonderful Christmas gift. And your boss would really benefit from the subscription. I tweeted that a couple times this week, and oh my. But Cobus, you said as a whole that despite everything that Secretary Blinken laid out. Despite all of the ambitions of the White House, you and I know some of the people who worked very hard to put the summit together. It was a break with the past. I mean, they didn't call countries S-holes. They didn't say that making up Nambia. They did a lot of things that were very encouraging. But at the end of the day, you were underwhelmed. That was the word you used. Why?
Well, in that same piece, I said that the summit refreshed the relationship and renewed the relationship, but didn't revolutionize the relationship. And someone that we know in the administration said, well, hey, we weren't aware that this was the brief. Like, we needed to revolutionize the relationship. The point is that what China has been doing, kind of over the last 20 years in Africa has been revolutionary. It's been, this is why we're busy here recording this podcast right now. It's because, what China did in Africa was essentially change Africa's position in the world and kind of reshape what African development could look like, and kind of like set a new set of kind of like talking points and agendas and standards for what development could look like in Africa, kind of good and bad. And in contrast, the U.S. summit tended to lean into fields that the U.S. has already emphasized, so democratization, health, for example, all very, very useful and all very valuable. But again, not necessarily breaking new ground. Also, I think it was very much shaped by what's possible on the US side, rather than, as we've seen in the last FOCAC, where there's quite a lot of input from the African side about the development of new kind of fields of the relationship. On the US side, one got a feeling that the calculus was, and I mean, this is just my kind of looking from the outside, that the calculus was a lot of like what's possible on our side, kind of what can USAID and the DFC achieve together, for example, right? Kind of like, because we know that there are these really formidable agencies and mechanisms in the US government, but we also know that it's incredibly complicated and frequently quite rigid, and that it's difficult to make those institutions work together. So finding ways to make them work together as they have is really encouraging. But, it's coming from a place where I think there are certain priorities on the US side that need to be hit, and certain political realities that also need to be hit, which means that certain things are possible and other things are not possible. Some of the things that I think Africans would have been quite happy about, which are not politically possible, include things like dealing with fiduciary law on the US side to make the impact of private sector lending, which is overwhelmingly located in the US and UK, to make it easier to deal with debt restructuring processes, because we know that, that private debt far outstretches Chinese debt, on the African continent, and as an issue in debt restructuring has been very problematic. That, for example, rapidly and enlarging, like greatly enlarging the number of African students going to the US, for example, or, making it easier for Africans to immigrate to the US. All of those things would have been, are examples of these kind of like greenfield kind of areas which could actually reshape the relationship with Africa. But those are politically tough on the US side, so they were kind of off the table. So that's what I mean. It's, it was a strengthening of a relationship that we already know, rather than this kind of like bridging into new areas.
What's so interesting was that back in June, I went to a speech by Wendy Sherman, who is the number 2 at the State Department. And she came here to Ho Chi Minh City, and she went to Fulbright University, which is right down the street from me here in Saigon. So I went to go listen to her. And she said the biggest priorities for the United States in Vietnam and Southeast Asia is climate and health. And everybody in the audience kind of looked at each other and was like, really? Really? Okay, let's hear her out. And she said, climate is going to be the most important thing. And then healthcare, we're going to deliver massive healthcare. And USAID, by the way, is very strong in delivering healthcare. The problem is, though, is that when you align the narratives of the United States on climate and health with China on economic development and infrastructure, there's a mismatch there. And Joe, I'd like to get your take on this. The United States is literally the largest oil producer in the world. Not the largest fossil fuel producer, but the largest oil producer in the world. How does the world's largest oil producer have credibility on climate? It is also the world's second largest emitter of carbon emissions. How does that reconcile? And then on healthcare, we have the largest uninsured population in the G7. We also have literally the world's most expensive care provided. We are not a global leader on healthcare. And so this is a problem in terms of a narrative. And it looks like they've got, as Cobus, you pointed out, this global thing, climate and health, that's our 2 things. What they should have been talking about is what the United States does so incredibly well, capital formation, entrepreneurship, business, technology, finance, services, education. That's where our strengths are. And instead, they're talking about all these things that we're actually not leaders in. To me, Geraud, that was part of the disconnect, I think.
Yes, that was part of the disconnect. But to be fair, among the deals that they've signed or the commitment they signed, there was a lot of those commitment and deals around those.
There's a lot of tech.
Yes, a lot of techs, a lot of small business enterprise, a lot of those financing. There was a lot of traction there. But the problem is, in that regard, is the fact that from an African perspective, the population, people expect more from the government initiative, So when the US is, for example, giving $1 billion that's going to go through small enterprise, through future funds to be boosting startups and everything, startups are going to see that. But from a larger perspective, from a general perspective, people will not feel it, will not see it as if it was a government-led project. If the government say, I'm bringing that much money and I'm putting that on the table coming from the US, it's going to speak louder than those small initiatives where the US is really present. And to credit to them, they go to places where you don't see a lot of Chinese movement there, like in small business enterprise, to future funds, to those kind of startups, business. They were there. They were at least showing that they're willing to move on that field. But the problem is those fields are not really visible from an African perspective, where you have bad infrastructure, you have bad public service and everything. So people are expecting more from the public service, from the state, from the government than from the public sector. So when startups are getting much more help from the US or financing from the US, it won't be impactful. It won't be seen and felt by the population. That's why the end people are like, we don't really see much more what's coming from there. For me, it's much more a perspective problem than a real issue on how the US could have done it. Of course, they could have been different if they had come up with, as I said earlier, with much more deals with the government on big things that much are visible to the people than those small kind of deal where, it's more private to private.
In relation to the climate thing, I was also wondering, kind of like whether it would have gotten more press traction if it were framed in terms of electrification, like green, sustainable electrification rather than climate.
Well, they did talk a lot about electrification. I mean, they did. And they've talked about Power Africa. It was framed in climate, but it was not necessarily framed entirely in connectivity.
Because it would have then added this kind of like, well, we're bringing home this electrification initiative, which is always very, very popular in Africa,
Yes, in terms of climate, there was like this comment made by President of DRC, President Tshisekedi, in the forum on climate, because earlier this week, 2-3 days ago, there was like flood in Kinshasa where you had 141 people who were dead or who died during the flood. So Tshisekedi made a comment on the US made it in a peak. If polluted country had, they stuck to the commitment to meet climate change, we wouldn't have those kind of issues. We wouldn't be able to prevent those kind of issues. So he had kind of those. So it was those kind of places, they were like a try for different presidents to make a play on that, to say, we can do something on that. But yes, even if it was a climate, it would be much more visible in big things, energy and, hydropower or solar, those kind of projects.
Well, we were by no means alone in kind of casting a more skeptical shadow over the proceedings that happened this week in Washington. The New York Times, their first right at the end of the summit, here's the headline: Biden courts African leaders, but some are skeptical of big promises. I also want to play you some sound from Ian Bremmer, who was one of the most famous, most well-known commentators on international relations in the United States. He's the founder and president of the Eurasia Group, which is a geopolitical risk analysis company. And he, too, really wasn't that enthused by what he saw.
Dozens of African leaders in Washington, D.C., potentially the most stillborn summit the Americans have hosted since the Summit of the Americas, Latin America in L.A. Months ago, because the United States doesn't have much of a strategy. Certainly want to have more influence given how much the Chinese have been economically locking up so much of the political orientation of these countries. But that means money, and the Americans, this is, at the end of the day, not the top priority, not even close for the United States, given GDP and given role in the world. So I suspect it's going to be a lot of happy talk. There'll be some political alignment, but it's not going to be a lot of influence.
Cobus, what's your take on that? You, again, I think you share a little bit of what Bremer is saying here, that there's a lot of talk. Again, I think the U.S. tried to put some substance into it, but not a lot of coherence in the outcome of it. Aubrey Ruby, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, she said one of the problems with what happened this week is that dozens of programs, billions of dollars were all introduced, but it's all scattered all over the place. We don't have a concept for what this is. It's not like it was in the past with Prosper Africa, Power Africa, PEPFAR. These are brands. FOCAC for the Chinese. Everything gets piled into FOCAC, and people can then get their heads around it. Here, it's 50, 60, 100 things that happen. We don't all know what they were. We're going to transition to our conversation on the Chinese side of this, but before we go, what do you think of what Aubrey said, and what do you think of what Ian Bremer said?
I see what she means. On the other hand, there's always this you always fall both sides of this issue, because on the other hand, we've also seen a flurry of new initiatives announced over the last 2 years, Global Gateway, the PGII, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's a lot of frameworks that have been flying around. And so you have an announcement with a big name, and then immediately a bunch of questions about what that's actually what it's going to mean and what's new and so on, or you don't, and then everyone complains about that. Right, so it seems like one can't really win.
Well, you win if you back up the name with substance.
Yeah, but even in the case of FOCAC, FOCAC is as the Chinese frequently do, they put out a scheme, like an intellectual framework, and then it gets filled in later, right?
That's true.
So it seems coherent retroactively, but at the moment everyone is still like, what is this? As we see with the Global Development Initiative, exactly. I'm always hesitant to dismiss these summits as simply happy talk, as Bremer said, simply because, as Anthony Blinken said, there's a lot of need to go around, right? There's a lot of space in this area for different external actors to collaborate with Africa differently. So in that sense, I think it is useful that the US found it necessary to have this summit, that they found it necessary to make this point about their relationship with Africa, that actually revivified the relationship, because they could just simply not have. So in that sense, I think it is useful, and I think there's money coming in and investment coming in. So great. But, then move on to, even though the narrative is don't choose sides, the larger logic is please choose sides, right? So, it all comes down to some like narrative of competition, even if individual officials are trying to avoid that narrative. In that respect, that's less helpful. But also, once one puts it into that context, then it raises new questions, and for example, just, so we talked about the 55 billion, which is impressive in any respect, but at the same time, it needs to be put into context that it includes a lot of historical funding, as we said, but also that the US is so far up to November has allocated 66 billion to the reconstruction in Ukraine, and there's another 37.7 billion waiting for congressional approval for Ukraine. So that's one country, right? And I mean a particularly afflicted country, but still it's one country. Africa is 54 countries, it's 1.2 billion people, it's, as everyone says, it's the future, with the world's youngest population, etc., etc. So so in that sense, at some stage one has to put it into comparison, and then you're back to the horse race, is what I mean.
Yeah, and the folks in Washington will say that Ukraine is a primary geopolitical threat to the United States national security. Africa, that's why they can justify $100 billion in less than a year to go to Ukraine.
But at the same time, they're extremely upset, around even possible, rumors of a possible Chinese base in Equatorial Guinea, right? Which is immediately framed as a national security threat as well.
What Cobus mentioned in terms of Ukraine, the comparison, it's quite also interesting, because let's not forget how African countries voted on that war on Ukraine and everything, how it get the highbrows in the US, in the West. Because the case in Ukraine, from an African perspective, would be first of all, the war in Ukraine, people there was kind of responsibility from different countries. It was geopolitical move and everything. And there, they sent 65 billion for the reconstruction. They're going to build new stuff and everything. They're going to build the country back. But somehow they come to us, with the message, don't pick up the Chinese, don't choose the Chinese because their loan are difficult and everything. But in the same time, the Chinese are giving us those money that we need for reconstruction, for building and everything, for airport, for roads, for highways, So at the end, when you say now 55 billion, but you give us to 54 countries, let's not say 54 countries, because only 49 were invited and 5 were excluded for different reasons. So you're kind of like, 55 billion to divide and we don't really clear where it's going to go. Yeah, people are not really going to get excited about it. So that's why the number, when you compare it to Ukraine, you kind of see that there is that like, if they're willing to give 65 billion to Ukraine and even add more to what's happening there. So for us, coming to us and telling us, we're going to give you those 1 billion here, maybe 500 million here. But in the same time, we would like you to be more cautious on what Chinese money you are taking or not. People will be like, nah, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, and particularly in the context of the upcoming law, which I'm now blanking on the exact name of, but, that would essentially penalize, global South countries for dealing with Russia, right? Kind of, in that context, in the kind of Ukraine context, it isn't only an issue of political pressure. It also then becomes a kind of a budget issue for these countries, a kind of a decision about what they're getting from one side versus what they're getting from the other side.
So the Chinese had nothing positive to say all week about the summit. Global Times took the lead, as it's prone to do. Global Times is the Communist Party-run newspaper that is a tabloid, very sharp-tongued, and it oftentimes plays the role of the cynic-in-chief in China. And so all week they were running editorials, op-eds, they were running columns, news stories, saying basically how this is all just another ruse to contain China. And what's interesting, Cobus, is that you did a few media reviews this week as well, looking at the Chinese press coverage and the Chinese social media coverage. And again, while we talk about how the United States, and especially the media in the United States, is trying to frame this in terms of a geopolitical competition, that is the only way that the Chinese media and Chinese scholars frame the issue. They can't see it in any other way. So while we talk about the limitations of the discourse in the U.S., in many ways, it feels even more crippled in China.
Yes, and I think in a lot of ways we face the same thing, which is that only very small slivers of kind of like certain technocrats, kind of in Washington and Beijing are actually interested in Africa. The rest of the broad readership, kind of don't particularly need or feel they don't need any kind of any input on Africa at all, and they have very little interest in the continent. And so therefore, in order to get any kind of interest at all, one needs to frame it in, kind of in the press in Beijing and in Washington in relation to the competition. But as you said, it was very interesting to see how social media in China was almost completely silent on it, like no one cared. And then, the state media was foaming at the mouth, like super, super angry, so it's funny to see that contrast.
The only place we could find commentary on Weibo about the summit was on the U.S. Embassy Weibo page. That was basically it. We looked high and low for other comments. It wasn't there. But this question of the choice and not having African countries or other developing countries be forced to choose between the United States and China was a key theme of the conversations that took place both at the summit and around the summit in Washington. I'm going to give you two perspectives now, one from Secretary of State Blinken, and then we're going to get Geraud's favorite person, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Let's first hear how Secretary Blinken laid out this issue of choice.
There's no one model of good governance. There's no one model for how to build strong institutions. I think we have to be informed by each other. We have to be informed by local conditions, local needs. And from the perspective of the United States, this is also not about a competition with others. This is not about saying to our friends and partners, you have to choose. This is about offering a genuine choice, offering a genuine partnership, and hopefully together building a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. That's what we're animated by. We put out a strategy for sub-Saharan Africa a few months ago, and it really does bring together the three pieces that are represented here. The last thing I'll say is this. It's interesting, when you're in the Situation Room, as you know very well, oftentimes the diplomats are saying, gosh, we could use a little bit more defense and security or a little bit more development. And then the Secretary of Defense is saying, we need some more diplomacy to deal with this. And so we're constantly playing off of each other, but it's really increasingly in response to what we're hearing from our friends, from our colleagues, from our partners. That's what's animating us. That's the only way I think we're going to be successful in building this plane as our friends are flying it at 60,000 feet.
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary Blinken, and thank you very much for put any emphasis on the quality of the partnership, the content of that partnership, the nature of that partnership, and what the United States is doing to build it with all of Africa.
Now, there's some hidden code words in there. The quality of the relationship is definitely loaded language because, again, they will talk about high-quality infrastructure and they will talk about language that relates to the quality of the partnerships. And they, again, oftentimes use that to denigrate Russia, China, and people that they don't like. This question was also posed to Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who spoke at a semaphore conference, and he made a lot of news for lots of different reasons. We're going to talk about a few of the issues, but let's talk about this question of the choice.
With the relationship between Rwanda or Africa and China, or Rwanda and Africa and the U.S., I think the most important thing is, I speak for myself, I speak for Rwanda. I'm sure many Africans would have a lot to say. I don't think we need to be bullied into taking or making choices, choosing between US or China. It's really none of our business. I think we need to have both and others as partners, in as far as they also respect us and understand that we have something to contribute. There is a lot at stake for us. So we can have something to say. We need to have something to say. So whatever is going on between China and the US, and then that being brought to Africa, is something we need to treat carefully ourselves.
We can always count on Paul Kagame to be direct and blunt, and there he was. Geraud, African leaders like those in the Middle East and here in Southeast Asia have been adamant in saying they don't want any part of the U.S.-China conflict, and they don't want to be forced to take sides. There is increasing evidence that the United States, as Cobus has indicated, is starting to become more coercive in terms of urging countries to take sides. This is a case that was made by Evan Feigenbaum at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who talked about, we featured some of his comments on an earlier show, and he says, watch what happens when you put Huawei into the core of your 5G network, and you'll start to see that choices will be made for you. So what was your take on Blinken's assessment and the whole theme of this is not a competition, and then on what Paul Kagame said?
On the Blinken comment, my take was, it was really interesting to see the language of it first, because the rhetoric was, for me, it was on the shape of, on the form of it was more humble. I'd like to admit, to say that, there's not one model, because that has been one of the core elements that many African leaders have been saying when they talk with the West, when they talk about democracy and everything. And the fact they say there's no one model, it also kind of echoes to what China has been saying in Africa when it comes to the governance and stability and political and democracy. Say there's no one model that fits all. China has been pushing that narrative by saying, we cannot force one country to choose the kind of governance, the kind of political stability wants to build. So when Blinken says that, I was like, whoa, it kind of used the Chinese language in terms of there's no one model. We're not going to push you in terms of choosing the kind of political model, the kind of political institution you want to build to create that stability. But in the same time down the line, he came and say, but we'd like to make a race on the top. So it was kind of, I'm giving you on one hand, but I'm going to be holding on the other hand. So it tells you a lot, at least on the way it presented it, that, we're trying in a way to present it that we don't want to put in a situation where you have to choose. That's, for me, what the Blinken comment told me is like, okay, but African leaders can just decide just to pick up on the first part. Even Chinese, Blinken said it himself. There's no one model. So we have to be more aware of the local content, local situation, local context to say, okay, they choose that path. That statement itself can become problematic down the line years later, even months later, because Blinken himself said there's no one model. But on the other part of say, we don't want you to choose. And the comment that Kagame said, yes, many African countries don't want to choose. They don't want to put in a situation where they don't want to choose. They don't want to be forced on choosing China and the US and everything. But on that side as well, there is a kind of, I'd say, hypocrisy interested in the way African leaders relate to the U.S. to the matter of their own internal politics. And when you mention Kagame's comment, Kagame is making a good point. But when I now put it in the context where Kagame is talking about we don't want to be choosing, we want to be able to make our own decision at the same time, himself in Africa is making a move that's endangering other countries, endangering the cohesion of countries like the DRC's political stability in the DRC. So in that context, when we know how those two countries, for example, DRC and Rwanda, are related to the US when it comes to their own political stability, you kind of have that position where those two countries, when they go to the US, they don't want to be forced to choose, but they know when it comes to their internal own political power and stability, they know they won't go to China because China will not be, the one becoming the peacemakers or the peace broker. No, they will go to the US, and the US will have something to say on how to do, where to go, on what kind of move to do. So it really created that question of cohesion and coherence in their policy to the US and how they relate to US and China. With China, they know money, infrastructure, all of that. But when it comes to other issues much more pressing, political stability and peace in the region, they know that the US and the West are the only ones that can become the main actors. They're really the ones putting the foot on the plate and take the lead on the discussion. So for me, it's really a weird relationship. They don't know how to assume, really to take responsibility of it. So if we don't want to choose, let's be responsible on how we deal with those issues until the end.
I so agree. What I find incredibly frustrating about this circle, we don't want people to choose. We don't want to be forced to choose. It's it's one of those kind of talking points that allow people to actually bypass the actual issue, right? Because which is, what do African governments actually want? And the way that it's always being kind of couched in terms of forced choices then leaves African governments' own kind of intentions off the table. And frequently those intentions are not stated. They're kind of studiedly ambiguous in order to kind of maximize political maneuverability for African leaders at home. And part of what then comes in, there's this kind of fantasy that runs through both the US and China's engagement with Africa, which is this fantasy that what African leaders actually want is African development, which I think is really, really up for question. I think in a lot of cases, African development is quite lower on the list of priorities, kind of below kind of political feasibility at home. And so you have a situation like in South Africa, for example, where at the moment, electricity problems are off the charts. The country is falling apart. It's the electricity grid is falling apart. It's taking the country's economy with it. The CEO of the Paris Statal Electricity Company has just resigned, seemingly undermined and kind of forced out. Who knows what's going on in there. But all of the calculations in the government doesn't have to do with the developmental impact or how to a green transition, blah, blah, blah. All of this has to do with what's politically feasible and what's politically, kind of political kind of machinations within the party. And, kind of who was covering who and who, kind of who lost political influence and therefore they couldn't kind of protect this guy, et cetera, right? Kind of there's a lot of those kind of internal wranglings in which both development and electrification and green transition and so on, are important, but they're kind of parked to the side, right? And that, I think, is true for many African governments. And this kind of but they're going to be forced to choose sides, that whole narrative is there essentially to cover these leaders to not ever have to articulate what they actually want to achieve. Sorry for the rant.
We're running out of time. We're trying to get this done in under an hour. We've got two other key points. The questions of debt came up quite a bit, again, on the sidelines of the summit, not in the summit itself, specifically Chinese debt. This was brought up again to Paul Kagame, Paul Kagame has been very outspoken on this issue for a number of years and pushing back on many of the U.S. narratives. Again, he was at the Semaphore conference, and Steve Clemons, the host, who, Lord have mercy, if anybody needs a subscription to what we do, Steve Clemons definitely does. I mean, it's painful to watch some of the stuff. Honestly, it's, when he interviewed Qin Gang, the ambassador, and it was a great opportunity to interview the ambassador, but you'll hear him talk about this, that he said, this little birdie told me that, Qin Gang is going to be the next foreign minister. It's not a little birdie. Your sources aren't that great. Everybody's talking about the fact that Qin Gang is going to be the ambassador. But anyway, it was painful for us to watch Steve Clemons. But other than that, the more interesting comments came from Kagame himself. Let's take a listen to his conversation with Steve Clements.
On Monday, I interviewed Qin Gang, the ambassador of China to the United States, and my intelligence services tell me, my Steve Clements that there's a good chance he'll be named foreign minister of China shortly. He said he would go, if he was in such a position, potentially to Africa. Africa is the bedrock of Chinese foreign policy. I asked him about the Chinese debt trap, the so-called debt trap, and he said there is no debt trap. I think I'm paraphrasing, there's sort of debt opportunities or their financial opportunities. But is there a Chinese that when you look around other states in Africa, maybe with Rwanda, are there problems, even geopolitical problems, in the financing and trade and economic relationship with China that we should be aware of?
Well, if there is any debt trap with any country and China, I think we should blame it on both sides. Because if you keep being drawn into a debt that you're not sure how you're going to repay the debt, then you also have a problem as the one who keeps giving you money. But for them, those ones who keep giving you money and knowing that you won't be able to pay, maybe for them it's a plan. In the end, they own everything about you. So that's a problem.
Oh, God. I mean, we're never going to get away from this. And by the way, next week, coming up on our China Global South podcast, we are literally going to be doing the mic drop on the China debt trap issue. We're going to have a conversation with two researchers who looked into the debt in Sri Lanka, specifically related to Hambantota. And what they say was it was the private bonds, the private creditors. That's the problem. And in Africa, that is the issue. Cobus, you and I know all too well that BlackRock right now is a major stumbling block in Zambia's reconstruction. And at the same time, that Chinese debt accounts for less than 20% of Africa's total debt, and a share that's going down, given the fact that private creditor and multilateral is going up. And the fact that Chinese debt is concentrated in about 5 to 10 countries at most, in terms of the bulk of it. So it's just a poorly informed question, and it's just annoying that, you're not looking at the broader issue of debt that also has complicity from the United States and Western countries who, again, have the governing laws that they can loosen up in order to do something, as you've talked about with the fiduciary laws in the UK and the US. So just...
Well, exactly. It's just so maddening because the conversation is shaped in this way where the role of Western held private debt is just never discussed. And, and I recently saw charts which is it's beyond double of China's total lending, to the continent. It far outstrips any other form of financing on the continent.
With higher interest rates too, by the way.
Exactly. It's Chinese lending is problematic in lots of ways, but it's still concessional lending.
Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Not all of it, but a lot of it is still below market rates. Whereas, the bond debt is commercial lending. It's it's above, it's at market rates or higher, So.
But guys, I don't know if you've noticed on that issue, when it comes to respond to on that issue, even African head of states, they kind of never bring up those kind of argument. We are the ones bringing those arguments. They themselves do not put those arguments in perspective. When even Ethiopian ambassador in China was asked that question a few months ago, he did not bring up this question. Kagame did not bring up this argument. So it's kind of even from an African perspective, when they ask them the question, it's really easy to just break down the question and say, no, that's not the fact. The facts are here and there. We have to take into account those elements and you have to put it in perspective. We are the ones put that in perspective. From an African perspective, you're like, guys, why aren't you putting those questions in perspective yourself? When you ask those questions, why aren't you saying that, guys, you should be putting take this into account, those elements into account, to see that the way you're presenting the question, the way you're framing it, it doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground.
And let's go back to the key point that Wu Peng, China's top diplomat for sub-Saharan Africa, made, I think it was back in April, when he said, nobody put a gun to any African leader's head to borrow money from China. So that accountability question that Paul Kagame brings up, I think is very important. That at the end of the day, it's African leaders who are accountable for the decisions that they've made to take on this debt. This was not forced on anybody. And I think that's overlooked in all of this. It makes it, again, the point here is to almost infantilize Africans that they are somehow victimized by the Chinese.
But also to not make the broader point that the entire financing system facing the global south is wonky. It's like, there are very, very few options open to these countries. They are priced out of most of them. They, their risk profiles are really distorted. And so they have very few options, and in that landscape, lending from China is frequently the best option, because the other option is again market lending, which is essentially like going to a payday lender. You're never getting out of that debt, and that all in relation to the upcoming challenges of climate change. It's like mitigation and adaptation. Like, how are they going to pay for that? It's like, ugh.
Okay, let's close our discussion on one issue that seemed to rankle quite a few people, and it's on the question of President Biden and the fact that he did not hold bilateral meetings. This came from Peter Pham, who is very well known in the Africa circles. He's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also a former ambassador to the Great Lakes, I think it was, in the Sahel. He's very conservative. He was a Trump administration appointee, very hawkish towards China, too. One of the most outspoken anti-China folks in the Beltway regarding Africa. But he wrote on Twitter, "Kudos to Secretary Blinken for the marathon pace he has maintained at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. But African presidents must be wondering where the U.S. president is. At their summits with China or Russia, they get full-fledged bilateral meetings with their presidential counterparts." And he included a photo of a meeting that Blinken was having with African leaders and then a bilateral meeting that Putin had with African leaders. This also came up at the press conference with Jake Sullivan that we started the show with back on Monday, when a journalist asked him, saying, and the audio quality is not great, but you can hear the kind of tone from the journalist saying, listen, a lot of folks came from very far away and are spending a lot of money, and why aren't they getting FaceTime one-on-one with the president?
Thank you, Jake. I went around yesterday to see how much African leaders were paying for the hotel for this trip, and I realized that some of the hotels in DC were charging them up to $22,000 a night. So it's an expensive trip. Some of them will spend $50 million for countries where people live on less than a US dollar a day. And so my question is, if they have to spend all this money and travel thousands of miles, why didn't the White House plan one-on-one meeting with those African leaders?
Well, first, the president will have the chance to greet every single African leader and engage with them as they come for the dinner tomorrow night. Second, if you look at the substance of this summit, the sessions that he is going to sit with those leaders around the table and deal with, it is the things that they have asked to talk about that he will be talking about with them. And those leaders will have the opportunity to speak in those sessions to President Biden and to one another so that we can collectively come up with a common strategy to deliver for the people of Africa. And if you look at what substance this summit is going to deliver, from the business forum all the way through to the leader sessions, I believe that it is going to be 3 days where you will see put on display real, tangible deliverables and results that are going to improve people's lives. And ultimately, as I said before, I will ask you, judge us on the record of how that ends up playing out, but I'm confident that it is going to play out well.
My final question.
So Sullivan had to avoid the question. It is a sticking point. It is really the sharpest contrast in many respects between how the Chinese do diplomacy and how the United States does it. Because one of the hallmarks of Chinese diplomacy is that when it's the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi or with Xi Jinping, is they do these lightning round speed dating style one-on-ones. And, basically they make them wait in a corridor. You get your 5 minutes with the president, you get your photo, next, 5 minutes, photo, next. But you get that sense of personal diplomacy. And I think this really was a tactical mistake of the United States. They don't really do this very well. The United States does this diplomacy great with France, the United Kingdom, with Canada. You see the pictures in the Oval Office, shaking hands, everything's great. And from time to time, they did it with Ramaphosa. But Geraud, holy crap, if people are spending $50 million to come on a trip for 3 days, that isn't America's problem. And this is part of the problem, though, is that you saw the huge entourages that they brought with them to the summit. And they spent, African leaders and ministers like to live large. There's no doubt about it. I don't know. I think that's part of the problem too. But let's do this one-on-one thing, and then we're gonna walk out of here.
No, my take on this, I'm going to go first from the question itself. Personally, I don't think that because a president spent $15 million to come to the US, that's rewarding a right to have a face-to-face. That's, for me, that's not the point. And second of all, still on the cost of the trip, my friend, you know that you're coming to the US. You know that you haven't prepared big deals to sign for you, for your country to come. Why are you bringing an entourage of 20, 25 people, 30 people with you to spend that much money on a trip that basically will not bring you a high political or even economic return to your country? That's pointless for me. It doesn't make sense. But the part of the personal diplomacy, it's really important for African leaders. And what that you mentioned, it's really, that speaks a lot in Africa to say when they see Biden, Sarkozy, or Biden, Merkel, those kind of face-to-face, it speaks to the importance. Even if 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it speaks a lot in terms of how important is my country to the US. Because when my head of state go to the US and meets Biden on a face-to-face, it's really for the president himself, when he comes back, he really wants to show that, our country is important to the US, to the point that we're able to get a face-to-face with Joe Biden and to really talk about this issue that related to our country and our interests.
And that's how your president tried to spin it. Talk to us about the tweet that Tshisekedi posted with his photo with Biden.
Exactly. So the Tshisekedi communication team trying to put a spin on the multilateral meeting that Biden had with 6 African head of state because those countries are going to have election next year. So he had a meeting with 6 head of state, and each of them had an opportunity to take pictures with Joe Biden one-to-one. So the communication team in Tshisekedi, they kind of spin it to say, he had a brief meeting with Joe Biden before the multilateral meeting came after that. So, there was still that willingness to kind of spin it in a way that we want to show you that we had a one-on-one with Biden, even though we know that there was no bilateral meeting on that. But they tried, because for them it's very much important to show that we matter to the US. That's why we had that one-on-one meeting. And before finishing, let me get back to one of the answer that he answered the journalist. The fact that Biden had this multilateral meeting with different head of states when they were talking about different issues, they can and they can address those issues collectively. The problem is many African countries, especially in the case of DRC, they were coming hoping to address with Biden the issue of, for example, the problem they had with a country like Rwanda, for instance. So those kind of issues, you cannot expect a head of state coming to have a one-on-one to solve those issues, to expect that issue is going to be discussed collectively where you have all the other 49 head of state. No, they want to have a privilege and moment with you so they can address those kind of issues. So the approach of saying that, we are going to talk about those issues collectively, it's as if those all African countries who came there, they had the same issue and they had the same perspective on how to solve the issue. It's like just ignoring the fact that some of them, they have different issues than fighting against each other. So yeah, that was not really smart move and smart answer, I think.
I mean, I completely agree. I guess in defense of the organizers of the summit, a lot of the US's approach there is looking at cross-cutting problems, right? Kind of looking at kind of common problems and trying to identify common problems that they could then that they could then effectively address. And so in that sense, kind of the entire vibe of the conference was one of kind of collective cooperation. So so on the one hand, I definitely see the political optics and the convenience of having the kind of one-on-one kind of photo op. But I mean, with Xi, one knows that all of the deals and so on are prepared beforehand. That literally is just a 5-minute kind of exchange of pleasantries, and then that leader is moved along, right? So it's not it really is all about the optics.
But optics matter in politics. I mean, to say that it doesn't matter is just naive.
Optics matter, but at the same time, but again, kind of, it's like optics matter, but kind of like all of the actual problems, I think, should matter more. But that's not necessarily how it works.
We're over time already. We've covered a lot of ground. We zigzagged a lot more than I had hoped we were going to zigzag, but it's just the nature of what this thing is. It's a hydra-headed kind of beast where it went in so many different directions. There were so many different themes. Again, it was a mix of really exciting initiatives. To see Africa getting this much attention is also really important. And don't take it for granted. that there's not a big groundswell of support inside the Beltway for Africa. This was noted by a number of scholars who say what we need to do is we need to generate more interest to wider swaths of American society in order to get more interest into African policy. So we should never take this for granted. That being said, there were a lot of shortcomings to it. It was problematic in a number of different ways. I think it fell short on their communications and their tactical communications as well. But before we go, let's get a final reflection from the both of you about the summit and whether or not this question of the competition with China is germane. Geraud, we'll start with you, and Cobus will give you the last word.
For me, it was as you said, it was really interesting meeting, and it shows the effort of the U.S. to become to remain relevant in Africa and really trying to counter the China-Russia narrative on the continent. I wrote a piece on that in French. I hope people are going to read it. I'm gonna feature it on the newsletter today. That the issue that speaks about how China and Russia kind of dominated the narrative also speaks about how much Africans were not able to shape the agenda of the meeting. It's really important for African countries to be able now to put forth in those meetings what their agenda is, what they want, what they expect, to be really communicating a lot about that, so they at the end they don't kind of just feel they just receive everything that they're coming to them. They need to be able to to shape the narrative and to put it forward, to put their own interest. So in the next meeting, you're gonna have different. We may have different kind of topic to talk about, and talking about the next meeting. It's also one of the issues I raised in the column I wrote this week, is the fact that we need to have much more consistency from the US in those US Africa meeting. Do we have a date? Do we have a commitment that we're going to have another U.S. Africa meeting in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? Without that, it's just going to be one of those meetings that comes and go, and we don't really have that much more to that. So the U.S. needs to become more consistent in a way of approaching U.S.-Africa relation, and Africa needs to become much more vocal on the interest and the topic they want to raise and to talk about, and to be able to shape the agenda, not only with the U.S., but also in those FOCAC and the other meetings as well.
No commitment on the next meeting, but there is a hint, or maybe a promise. I think they promised that Biden is going to go to Africa next year. So there'll be his first trip as president to Africa. Cobus, you get the last word.
I think in lots of ways the US-China competition is very convenient for global South countries. No one demonstrated that more effectively than the Solomon Islands, right? Kind of like ignored for decades. The moment there's engagement with China, 200 American diplomats show up, right? So it's so you can wield the competition between China and the US to your needs, to your national needs, as long as these global South countries, in Africa particularly, have clear ideas about what they want and what they want to achieve. And that, I think, has been a real disappointment, I think, in Africa. It's like, kind of like if one compares the situation of Africa to the small island developing states in the South Pacific, who they've really been shaping the discussion in, kind of around climate issues, for example, particularly at COP27 in November, where they essentially reshaped the global discussion about North-South climate relations, right? I mean, these are tiny countries. Africa is much bigger, much richer, much more dynamic, many more people. And I think Africa has really been falling down in terms of its thought leadership. The thing is, kind of everything is couched in terms of what are we going to get from X? How are these kind of powerful superpowers going to impinge on our freedom or make us forced to choose things? Or kind of how are they going to be kind of acting in our territory? Whereas the question should, what we know from looking at regions like ASEAN, right, is once that train is moving, once that region has starts trading with itself and starts setting its own agendas and start kind of moving in its own developmental direction, then everyone is scrambling to get on board. Whereas in Africa, everyone is still so happy to couch a relationship in terms of this kind of active global North, passive global South, where Africa isn't setting its own agendas. They're just not. And I think that is the core problem. Once they kind of move forward in that direction, then it changes everything else.
Okay. That is a somber, depressing, downtrodden note. But then you're South African, Cobus, and given the week that you've had in South Africa with no power and all, I mean, that's what you guys do these days, I guess. So, listen, thank you both for the insights. Let's start first with Geraud. Geraud, we want to make sure that everybody knows about the great work that you are doing at Projet Afrique Chine. It's our Francophone service. Tell everybody how they can sign up for your free newsletter and follow you on Twitter.
So guys, you can follow us on Twitter, Christian Geraud, that's my personal account, but you also can follow us on Afrique Chine, Afrique with a K, so you're gonna be updated on all the news that we are covering. So this week we made a large coverage of the U.S. Africa Summit, giving the Chinese spin, what's happening there, it's all in French. If you want to receive our newsletter, you come on the website, projetafriquechine.com, you're just gonna register update, not really, you don't have to file any form, you just come and you don't have to fill any form, just come and write down your email on the top, and you're going to be receiving twice a week, every Tuesday and every Friday, our free newsletter covering different topics that we're covering in the China-Africa project. So yes, that's really a way to keep you updated on everything that's happening in China, within China and Africa in French. And yes, that's it.
And also, Geraud is the host of a fantastic podcast, Afrique Chine, as well. Sign up for that anywhere you get your podcasts. Don't miss it. He's interviewing some fantastic guests. And again, the discourse in the Francophone world is sorely, sorely needed. And so the work that Geraud is doing is so important. And for those of you who speak Arabic, Nesrine Kamal, our Arabic editor, is doing everything the same. So you can sign up for her free newsletter and also her podcast, and you can go check out her site. Just follow the links on our homepage at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. Also, we would love for you to follow the work that Cobus, myself, and the rest of the team are doing in our English service. Every day we're putting together just a thorough, deep dive into everything that China is doing throughout the Global South. This week, it focused a lot on the events in Washington, but we also covered the dramatic events that unfolded on the Sino-Indian border last week and the follow-up reaction to that. Again, very worrisome clashes that are taking place there, and the attack on the hotel in Kabul, where a number of Chinese expatriates were staying as well. So those are the kinds of things that we do to really save the time for you to have to look for all these things. Cobus, myself, and the team go out and curate that and put analysis every single day. Sign up at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. By the way, we're going to be increasing the rates next year just a little bit, so try to sign up before the end of the year to capture the $7 a month for students and teachers, or $15 a month for everybody else. We'll leave the show there. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Until next week, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.